All right, so we made it through the alternative setups in some depth. And so now I think what we need to do is start looking at the main setup that we're aiming for when we play the Chameleon Slav and spend some time examining this pawn structure. And so, as we mentioned early on in this series, this structure here is the structure that we aim for when we play the Chameleon Slav. And our idea of a6 is to use that to help us get our bishop out to f5 or g4 before we play e6. And then that a6, if we remember, was meant to help protect this d5 pawn against early queen to b3 maneuvers. And so if we step back and just look at this pawn structure a little bit, because this will be what we'll be getting a lot of the time, we just want to make some general observations. And originally I thought, well, maybe I'll do like a really detailed video and go through all the different kind of ideas with this pawn structure. And then I realized that would be quite a long video. And so how I decided I want to try to handle this is to break it up and maybe cover a game or two per video, and then we'll discuss the pawn structure and how it relates to these games. And so for this video, I think the thing that I want to focus on is that if we look at this structure that we're aiming to get, and note that our bishop would be outside this pawn chain, and this is what we do unless they prevent us from doing that when we play the Chebanenko or the Chameleon, is that white is going to have more space, right, than we do as black. So we have a very solid structure with no weaknesses. That's the good thing. The bad thing is that we have less space. And so if we just set up the structure and just sit here, that's not going to go well because our opponent's going to have more space than us. And, perhaps, maybe it take a bit of a stronger player, to fully take full advantage of that. But I guess I would say is what we want to do as Chebanenko players is realize that we have less space here and realize that we can't just sit in this structure long term. We need to be alchemists. We need to change this pawn structure. We need to do something active to change the structure to get more space back and to help activate our pieces. Now, if you're a masochist and you want to just sit there, sit back in the structure and get shelled, well, this Chebanenko, this Chameleon would be the perfect opening for you. You just get in this position and then just sit there and see what happens, I guess. But that's not how I plan on trying to play this, and so I'm going to try to learn how to best play from this pawn structure and how to change it into another pawn structure, in a way that improves our position. And so if we think about it in this pawn structure here, a few ways that we can try to change the pawn formation to gain space from ourselves and kind of break free from this space disadvantage we have. Well, we could play e5, and that would help us get more space. We could play c5, and that would help us get more space. And another idea would be to possibly play f5 and try to get more control of the center and a little bit more space. And so I found a game. The one I want to start with is to have us analyze a game and from this pawn structure, and then over time we'll look at, my hope is to look at more games and then look at it from a pawn structure perspective and to see how it plays out in actual games. But in this game, I wanted to look at what happens. We said that white has a bit more space, and so with more space, there comes an increased opportunity for white to try to attack. And so if white were going to try to do a kingside attack and pile up on our h7 square and try to fully use this b1 to h7 diagonal, well, this would be a pretty good way of going about it. And so how they may do this is they may delay the development of this b1 knight so that they can get bishop to d3 in as quickly as possible and prevent our bishop from going to f5, trying to beat us to the punch, so to speak. And so I found a game that I want to go through, and I think it's really good because it illustrates a couple concepts of how we should be looking to play from the black side of this. And so this game, the black player who played the side with our pawn structure was Dariusz Schwirtz, and he's a Polish-American grandmaster. I think he became a grandmaster at a really young age, like 14 or something. And he's playing a 2400 player, and he kind of plays a model game for us in this Chebanenko main structure. So let's start working our way through this game. We can see that it doesn't start out with our traditional move order, and that's okay because it's going to transpose into it. And sorry, Lichess is being a little slow right now for some reason. I'm not sure why. But we notice that we get into our Chebanenko kind of setup, and as I said, he has delayed the development of this knight, and in doing so, he quickly got his bishop out to d3. And what that does is that prevents us from immediately putting our bishop on f5. And so when we covered the alternative setups, we took it from the perspective of, okay, if they prevent us from setting up our Slav, our Chameleon Slav pawn formation with our bishop outside the pawn chain, then we use one of those alternative setups. Now, something to remember in this position is, yes, our opponent, he stopped black from playing bishop to f5, but he didn't do anything to keep the bishop from going to g4. And so that's what Schwirtz did in this position. He just simply played bishop to g4. And then that's another idea of delaying the development of the knight, is they can develop it to d2 instead of c3. That's what white did here. Black just continued to develop. And now we see what we had in this, is this queen-bishop battery piling up on h7. And so right now, he can't just take it, obviously, because we got our knight and rook on that pawn. But that's one theme, is that white has this space advantage, and they can try to use that space advantage for a kingside attack, possibly with the pawn storm, coming along, and then play on this active b1 to h7 diagonal. Now, black plays e6, and we got our Chebanenko pawn structure. So this is what we looked at first. We have this same pawn structure in the game, with the bishop successfully outside of the pawn chain out to g4. And in this game, white played b3. He noticed that the bishop is blocked from developing along the c1 h6 diagonal because of this e3 pawn, and so his plan is to then route it to b2 instead of trying to develop it traditionally. Black just put the bishop on the most active square. Nothing special here so far. And then now we see an interesting move by black. And you'll see a lot of very strong players will make this move in this position. And that move is queen to b8. And that's a very interesting move, because when we looked at this in the beginning of this video, we said, well, ways to try to fight back to, kind of help our space advantage. Well, one of them would be to try to break with e5. And so what that does is now we got 3 pieces on e5, because the queen x-rays through the bishop to this e5 square. And we can't get it in quite yet because he has 3 defenders on that square. But it is creating a strategical threat at some point. If he relieves defenders from e5, we can push that through. And so just the threat is actually useful as well. Oh, and I should mention, you may ask, well, why didn't they play queen to c7? Because then we can castle, have our rooks connected. Well, the idea is that we want to keep this pressure on e5. And if we moved our queen to c7, then after a move like c5, we would have to move away. And now we're no longer fighting for that e5 square. So in the game, White castled, black castled. Now white plays h3, and here white played bishop or knight to g5, and so pretty obvious what's going on here. He's piling up on h7 and saying, well, you got to do something about it. And then here's where black plays a really instructive move, and it's even though it's obvious, it's very instructive. He plays bishop to g6, and he's neutralizing the threat on this diagonal, and he's also going to be getting another piece off the board, right? Because that's the other kind of theme of this, is we inherently have less space than our opponent when we play this pawn structure. So if we can get a piece or two off the board, that is helpful. It kind of alleviates our space, our cramping effect. It's kind of like if I've heard people use the house analogy. It's kind of like, well, we start out with what, like 7 pieces, and if you have like a 5-bedroom house and you got 7 pieces, then a couple people are sharing a room. So if you get it down to 6 people, you get rid of one of the guests, get it down to 6 people, then only one person has to share a room, right? So that's kind of the same idea with chess here. If we can get a piece or two off the board, then our space advantage or our space disadvantage isn't as much of a disadvantage. And so that's why this move not only stops this threat, but it also, tries to accomplish the goal of getting rid of a piece off the board. And it's kind of like their good bishop, their key attacking bishop that is very useful on this b1 to h6 diagonal. And so white ended up taking this bishop. So, one small victory for black. They got a piece off the board, and they got a very good piece of white off the board. So now you can notice by setting this battery up, lining up on this e5 square, right now we still have 3 attackers to push through e5 with, and white only has 2 pieces defending that square. And so in this game, what white ended up doing, white, being a strong player, recognized this threat, right? And so they played f4 to get rid of that threat. Now we can't bust with e5. However, we have another option, and that is c5. And that's exactly what black did here. He used the threat of this e5 break, trying to change this structure and to regain his share of space, right? Like the alchemist trying to change this thing. The threat of that now gets him, he has time, and he's just going to play c5 instead, and that's what he does. So he plays c5. It's just, not sound like a broken record, but it's important to fight back actively, and just remember that we can't just sit passively in these restraint structures. Basically, what we're doing is we're restraining them long enough in order, to keep them at bay for long enough so that we can strike back. So now that black has done that, once black strikes back with c5, now he's got his equal share of the space, and this is likely an even position now. And so he captures towards the center. White is kind of flooding his pieces over to the king side, but the structure, this position is too solid to actually get an attack going. And now we see this trade, a further trade. Now this isn't done to alleviate the space disadvantage at this point, because we've kind of taken care of that problem, right, with our c5 break. The point of this is this bishop is the defender, keeping this pawn from running down and promoting. This is a key defender for that. And so by getting rid of that bishop, now this pawn becomes even stronger. And in the game, black played b5, but I'll turn the engine on here, and the thing to know, you can see the evaluation bar. The thing to know is that this is almost, this is actually winning for black, is just start, pass pawn, you get a pass pawn and you push it, right? So c3 here would have been winning more easily. And I think the interesting thing about this is if we look, and this was just about a half a dozen moves ago when black played c5, changing the pawn structure and gaining space, and a half a dozen moves later, we have transformed this into a winning game. If we would have just sat there in that structure, this wouldn't have came about right here, right? So obviously black's a strong grandmaster, understands all this, but we can learn a lot from this, right? Made the threat of breaking with e5, used the time to actually get in c5, so e5 break, c5 break, got to do something, got to fight back actively, get space. And we'll just quickly flip through this game. Black, of course, went on to win Grandmaster technique. But we'll just kind of quickly flip through here. It's not like a rook and pawn endgame lesson or anything like that. But as we kind of notice, though, is notice how in these chameleon positions, even when we're looking at the alternative lines, a lot of this has to do with creating little tiny threats and then converting it like the alchemist into something else. Often it's getting control of an open file, and that is just enough to squeeze somebody and win an endgame. Well, look at how he kind of transforms this into a winning endgame. And if obviously this requires technique, these rook endgames are not easy to win, and it's probably a draw if two computers are battling, but it's certainly going to be black who has the chances to win here. And I'll just quickly flip through this so we can see how black went about this. But always good to get rooks behind pass pawns for both sides. It would be ideal for white to have his rook where black's rook is, behind it. But this now is obviously going to be lost for white. He's just going to start shoving his pass pawn. There's nothing that white can do about it. Played on quite a while, actually. But this is where the game ended, and white resigned. But anyway, that's kind of how I want to go about trying to study these pawn structures. This main Slav pawn structure is kind of trying to find some good games like this that kind of illustrate effective ways of trying to play this pawn structure for the black side. So I hope you guys found that useful. Hopefully I make no promises, but I hope to try to make more coverage on these main lines, and then maybe hopefully eventually transfer over to the exchange Slav structure, because we'll see that a lot too when we play this chameleon. All right, have a good one, everybody.